Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to the Future History Project. That's Isaac Asimov's Future History, and we're continuing to read robot short stories from his The Complete Robot. And instead of doing three on this video of the five that we are reading this week, I will do two. The reason for that is that these are the second half. These two stories, Reason and Catch That Rabbit, are the second half of the Powell and Donovan stories that Isaac Asimov wrote. Now, these weren't, Reason was the first story that he actually wrote in the Powell and Donovan series, and that was published in 1942. No, sorry, 41. And it was one of the first stories that Campbell actually bought from him, like a third or fourth story, I think it was. And it was the second actually robot story after uh, Robbie was purchased. Uh, and then, but the version of Robbie that we read was the sort of added to version later. And now, it's not the first Powell and Donovan story chronologically. It is actually the third story, Reason, that we'll be doing, and then Catch the Rabbit, which is the last one that he wrote. But he wrote Reason first, then he wrote First Law. That was rejected by Campbell, and it wasn't published till actually 1956. And then Runaround, which is actually the second story in the series, was accepted by Astounding as well, but that was the third. That was the third Powell and Donovan story, but second chronologically. And then the fourth one is Catch That Rabbit that we'll be dealing with is was published in 1944 in Astounding. Now, these have many things in common. It has the characters Powell and Donovan. The First Law, as we saw, only really has Donovan telling this tall tale, BSing and getting free beer in a bar. So the Reason, as I say, is the third story, but they also have common things with them that each robot series has a serial number, and in Reason, the serial number is QT, and they name the robot Cutie. So like as in cutie pie. And all the others have similar. Like in First Law, it was Ma, or Emma, as they called the robot. And in Runaround, it was SPD, Speedy. And in Catch That Rabbit, it was DV for Dave. But let's get back to Reason. As I say, this was the first story, and it was accepted without changes by Campbell, and because he liked it, and they're set on a space station that collects energy from the sun and then beams it to Mars, Moon, Earth, wherever. And at this time, it's going to Earth, and Powell and Donovan are our team that go out and troubleshoot, and they get the worst jobs from the U.S. robots and mechanical men, because at this point it's been established that robots have been outlawed on Earth, so they can't be sort of made live and workable on Earth. So they are sent out in parts and assembled wherever they're going to work. So Powell and Donovan, at this case, is setting up this new robot, QT, to take over the human aspects of the space station for the transmission of energy to Earth and other planets. and prior to that it was all humans, but then they've had robots, but this one is going to be a superior robot that will be able to make decisions and take the place of humans eventually. So, but they have a problem with this robot. He seems to he doesn't believe that Powell and Donovan built him. He says, because he uses reason to figure this out. It's like, because he thinks he's therefore, a being, and, these, flesh bags, as he almost calls them, inefficient bodies could not have created this. And he thinks the master is a sort of the god, the energy converter that's on the other side. So he starts thinking that is his creator, his god, and he had experimented with humans, and then now he's created a perfect uh, specimen, as in him as a robot, and he gets all the other robots to worship sort of him, and in effect the converter, the energy converter. And Powell and Donovan are just sort of pulling out their hair at this, and they try to explain to him, they try to reason with him to say, this is, you've woke up here, this is what we created this, and they even build another robot. And then but Cutie still says, well, that doesn't prove anything. You put it together, you didn't create me. And so they don't know what to do, but they realize that he's perfect. Like he aligns the beam better than any human can. He's so efficient, but he just doesn't believe. He believes that he's following a god in a sense, and it raises a lot of interesting stories of people's beliefs and their point of views of using logic, but the logic is based on certain principles, and if you establish those principles as the foundation of something, then everything else will follow. But then somebody else will have different foundational principles, and then they'll see something else, and that's sort of the conflict here, and the kind of thing. It's never that easy in real life, but he's positing possibilities. Asimov is. So they just realize, well, there's nothing they could do. So they're being relieved from from this by other humans, and they come and they tell, oh yeah, it's perfect. But then they find out that there's a new a robot that's set up, that's going to be sort of the leader, the master of other robots. Like they'll work in a team. So and sort of they will be the master. So hinting at the there's a screw up here somewhere probably, and they talk about that, where the U.S. Robots and Mechanical Men are sort of, it's a company, but it doesn't always, they don't always do things perfectly, and gaffes happen, and we've seen this previously with other ones like AL 370 or whatever it is goes astray. Like there's problems that happen. Um, but as I say, these are they do follow each other, even though they're written in different orders. Well, the first law is sort of out here somewhere. It doesn't really do much, but it's placed as sort of the first story, even though it was the second one written. And then the reason follows runaround, because they talk about being sent somewhere else, and then it starts out with sort of, well, they didn't think it maybe was a good idea to be put out in the cold, in the middle of nowhere. So but then that sort of ends, and then we see in the next story, in Catch That Rabbit, they've had, because they were going to go back to Earth and have vacation times, but they found out that they wound up with 6 months paid vacation, which was great. And then now they're on an asteroid, a mining asteroid, and they are working with this, robots where there's the master and the slaves, or as they describe it as the fingers of the main robot. And the main robot is a DV, which is Dave. And but strange things happened. They he just sort of they're supposed to be mining ore, and they get no ore, and the robot can't figure it out. He doesn't know what's going on, and it's kind of interesting. He talked like the nerve says, "Oh, it's giving me sort of nerves and stuff like that." So there's he's using human um, ways to explain how he feels and stuff like that, or the strangeness in his circuitry. And they we also find out that the he communicates with the other robots, his sort of minions, through a positronic wave, and nobody knows how this works. They can't sort of tap into it. They just know there's a positronic wave that is happening. And but they start observing them, and they find out, like, every so often, like, they do some strange things, like they'll go off dancing, and they'll wander off. They'll start doing things all sort of choreographed together, and they just can't figure it out. They interview, in a sense, like, ask questions for of Dave to find out what's happening, and then but he doesn't remember anything. He doesn't remember anything. It's just blanked out. But every time, but they see this happening, and then when they go there, as soon as they get within a certain distance, 20 feet, the robot realizes there's a human around, and then he snaps out of it, but he doesn't know what's happened. It's like there's a blank. But they interview one or several of the fingers, the other robots, and the robots sort of remember what's happened. It's like, they're doing this, and then all of a sudden there's an order that comes, but they don't quite get that order. Another one supersedes it, and they all just sort of start doing this weird thing. So they don't know what's happening. So, but they observe very closely, and they realize that what's happening is that he's sending an order, like when something happens, like when an emergency or something else happens, or something bigger, rather than just a routine of digging out the ore. So they get the brilliant idea that in the tunnel that they'll fake an emergency of a collapse. So they do that, and the robots do all this kind of thing, so they know that it's that kind of thing that's happening, like when it's an emergency type thing, or, as I say, something else that's out of the normal of digging. But they screw up because they trap themselves as well, because of the concussion and whatever of that fall, sort of traps them. And so they have to try to get the robots. They're too far away for the robots to sort of realize that they're there. But then one of them figures out, hey, he thinks he knows what's happened, so he kills one of the robots. He destroys one of the robots with a laser pistol. And he explains why he can't use that, normally on the rocks and stuff, because it'll just, destroy everything. So he covers that little basis as well. Like, you've got a gun, why don't you just destroy the rock fall, But he says, why you can't do that. So he gets around that little hiccup, as the writer does, Asimov. But yeah, because he realizes that it's because when he's telling them to do certain tasks, they're all separate. But when he sends out an order for all of them to do something, that's where it screws up. So they figure, well, then they now know what will happen, or how to get around it, or find the fault. So that's sort of where it ends with that. And as I say, there was only 4 stories that Asimov wrote for this. Now, we will be reading other robot stories that are from Foundation's friends. And there are 2 stories in there that are Donovan stories. but because I've moved those to sort of a different area because it's a little difficult to get, we'll be coming back to Donovan eventually in a number of weeks. And the other reason why I just chose these two stories is because the next group of stories are to do with Susan Calvin. She's our, excuse me, she's already sort of popped up with in these stories in name because they mention the old woman or something like that, because it sort of will you know it'll put those in the order of where it's supposed to be. And she's the robo-psychologist for U.S. robots and mechanical men, and that's the theme sort of running through this, because it sort of it places these in short order together, and they're coherent in the sense of being part of a future history. When he was writing all this stuff, Asimov, as Mark Richardson was saying, I'll leave the links to their channels for last week's, and Steve Donahue was part of the discussion there. That they're right in saying that Asimov never planned this. He even says he didn't want to do this. He was to write sort of a timeline for the future history. It's very ad hoc. It's put together, but occasionally there are things that sort of fit because he will, either out of laziness or of familiarity, and I think it's both. Because when he goes to write something, he doesn't need to explain anything, and okay, well, that was a successful story. He's got this universe, he's got these things set up like the U.S. robots and mechanical man. He doesn't need to explain that. He just states the name, and if you've been reading his stories, where that fits in and what that is. You don't need to explain it. It's a shortcut. And he continued to do this. And, Galactic Empire, well, you know what that is, and in a broader sense of the future history. So he just sort of plopped this stuff in, but without any real forethought that he was going to do this. It's like, okay, with the Donovan stories, okay, well, John W. Campbell asks for another robot story, or he feels like writing another robot story, and he sort of gets the idea, the dilemma that he wants to do, and then it's sort of like, okay, well, let's make it a Powell and Donovan story to get around this because it works for them, or a Susan Calvin story. So yeah, so it is uneven. That's why we've talked about that some things don't really seem to fit in correctly with the full future history, but they do in the sense of for ideas, like for the robotic ideas and what happens later, because it's sort of within his universe as a whole, and they do work. They're not fully integrated and coherent, but these four are to a certain extent. And Mark was right; he wasn't too happy with the first law, which I can understand that, because it is far fetched. It's silly, it's contrived, and the Emma and Ma and all this kind of stuff, but it sort of works for those characters, maybe not so much for the story line in as a whole, but they are connected together with the Susan Calvin. So these are a little more tighter because they do fit in better with a coherent storyline than other ones. So we are getting to that, and then with after the Susan Calvin ones, we'll be reading. Well, at the end of that, we'll be reading some other Susan Calvin ones that were written by other authors, and then we'll go into the novels, the trilogy that's written about Susan Calvin, and then we'll go back to some other short stories, and that's where we'll get the last of the Donovan stories, that were written by other writers and friends of Foundation. But yeah, so I think that's where I'll end it there, because, as I say, I took a little too long to talk about these two, but I do really like Powell and Donovan, Greg Powell, and Mike Donovan. they're comical characters, but they sort of fit it. Oh, the other thing that was really good in Catch This Rabbit was um, Catch That Rabbit or Catch This Rabbit. I just forgot that. Catch That Rabbit. Um, is that he talks about that he's got a big book of sort of the robot's handbook, and he talks about him, where he jumped through a window because the place was on fire, only in his shorts, and he saved the book. It's sort of like what would you save of your possessions? And for him it was the robot handbook, and he says, well, the shorts were optional. And I thought that was kind of neat, because he still shows that there's books, in the future. Even though at that time, are they gonna waste their space bringing this huge, massive tome or other books, through space, where weight is a problem, well, if you don't have anything else and you need the reference, yes, but you know, um, it's one of those things that, well, electronic, it would work, but also they smoke, as well through this. There's still cigarettes and they smoke, and obviously drinking beer and stuff like that is the story. So again, it's one of these things where the story is future, and some things sort of work as things worked out, in actual fact, or how it would be. But the other times they're grounded with the time that he wrote, and we saw that with Let's Get Together, with the Cold War that was still going on. But it's just they're fun stories, as I say, and sometimes you just can't look too far and too deep into them. But I really like it's just they're enjoyable, and then you sort of see the pieces that fit into the bigger whole, and that's, as with time goes on, we'll talk more about how these pieces that we're reading now will fit in to the future stories that we'll read, even though it wasn't planned that way. But because in hindsight he saw that, and then it's a shortcut, and being a bit lazy. And as Steve Donahue said in the Mark video, that he was like a workaday writer. It just sort of like, if that works, let's exploit it. Let's write more of this. And that's how he did. And I like Mark's comment in the video, which I say I'll put down the link below, where he says, like he wouldn't want to spend too long probably with Asimov at a convention. It could get kind of tedious, and I think it would. Anyway, I'll leave it there, BookTube, and we'll talk about Susan Calvin in the next video.